The flight that changed everything. Elena James was a woman of quiet strength and resilience. At 70 years old, she had built a life of triumph over adversity. Born into a humble home in the segregated South, Elena grew up learning to carve opportunities where none seemed to exist. She was a sharp student, determined to prove that limitations placed on her by society were only as real as she allowed them to be. By the time she reached adulthood, Elena had earned degrees in business and finance, built a thriving career as an entrepreneur, and created a legacy for her family. Her wisdom, accumulated through years of overcoming hurdles, shone like a beacon to those who knew her. Despite her successes, Elena had always lived with a simple philosophy. Life will always test you when you least expect it. How you respond will define who you are. She had repeated this mantra to her children and grandchildren over the years, passing down both the courage to dream and the fortitude to act. Yet nothing in her storied life could have prepared her for the events that would unfold on that unassuming day. A long-awaited journey. Elena's eldest granddaughter, Angela, had recently graduated from medical school, a remarkable achievement that filled Elena with immense pride. Angela had always been a bright spark, much like her grandmother, and she invited Elena to attend her graduation celebration in Los Angeles. For Elena, this was not just any flight. It was a celebration of legacy. Her granddaughter's success was proof of how far her family had come. With her finances secure and her independence intact, Elena decided to treat herself to a little luxury for the trip. After years of flying coach on business trips and vacations, she purchased her first-ever first-class ticket. It was a milestone for her, a testament to the life she had built. She spent the evening before her flight preparing carefully, selecting an elegant outfit that reflected her dignified style. A tailored navy blue dress, sensible low heels, and her favorite pearl necklace, a gift from her late husband. "Grandma, you're going to have such a great time in first class," Angela had teased over the phone. "Make sure you take a picture sipping champagne up there." Elena had laughed, brushing off the compliment with humility, but inside, she was excited. It wasn't about showing off. It was about the symbolism of it all. After decades of hard work, sacrifice, and unrelenting perseverance, she could finally enjoy the fruits of her labor. The following morning, Elena arrived at the airport with her usual composure. Her small rolling suitcase, perfectly packed, glided behind her as she walked through the bustling terminal. Travelers moved hurriedly around her, their faces buried in phones, their voices merging into a sea of noise. Yet Elena remained unfazed, a portrait of grace in the midst of chaos. The boarding gate. Reaching the gate for her flight to Los Angeles, Elena noticed the first-class boarding line. A few passengers were already there, business professionals in crisp suits, a young couple chatting about their vacation, and a retiree quietly reading the newspaper. Elena smiled to herself and walked forward, her ticket and ID ready in hand. As she approached the gate, the flight attendant standing there, a tall, clean-cut man in his mid-30s, barely looked up from his tablet. Elena offered him a kind smile. "Good morning, sir. I'm here for first-class boarding," she said, presenting her ticket. The attendant's eyes flicked up briefly. His expression changed ever so slightly, but the warmth she expected never came. Instead, there was a flicker of something darker, judgment, perhaps, or condescension. He looked Elena up and down, as though assessing her place in the space she was attempting to occupy. "This is first class, Mom," he said curtly. His voice had an edge, though his tone was laced with artificial politeness. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" Elena blinked, taken aback. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard him. "Yes," she replied calmly, holding out her ticket. "I'm quite sure." He took the ticket, but barely glanced at it before shaking his head dismissively. "This must be a mistake. First-class tickets are reserved for, well, those who've booked appropriately. You'll need to move to the back." The words hung in the air like a slap. Elena's heart skipped a beat, and a murmur spread through the nearby crowd. She glanced around at the other passengers. Some turned away awkwardly, pretending not to notice, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Elena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a sharp sting of humiliation cutting through her usual calm. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm. "There's no mistake. This is my ticket, purchased and paid for." But the flight attendant, whose name tag read Jason, was unmoved. He gave a derisive chuckle, shaking his head as though Elena were a confused child. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you're doing, but first class is for qualified passengers. You're holding up the line." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Qualified? What does that mean? The implications in his tone were unmistakable, and they cut her to her core. The weight of the moment. Elena had faced prejudice before. Growing up black in the segregated South had taught her to recognize the quiet daggers hidden in polite words. She remembered the restaurants where she had been turned away, the bank officers who had underestimated her intelligence, the countless times she had been forced to prove her worth. But here, at 70 years old, after decades of accomplishments, to be dismissed so cruelly and publicly, it felt like all those years of progress had evaporated. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't a woman who raised her voice or caused a scene, but neither was she someone who would allow herself to be diminished. "Sir," she said, her voice even, though her hand shook slightly, "I have every right to be here. This ticket is mine. I suggest you verify it properly." Jason didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he waved her aside, gesturing for the passengers behind her to move forward. "Next, please," he called out, ignoring Elena as though she were invisible. It was in that moment, standing at the gate, surrounded by silent onlookers, that Elena felt something shift deep within her. The humiliation boiled into something stronger. Resolve. Her posture straightened, and the fire that had carried her through life reignited. "This isn't over," she said softly to herself. As the final boarding call was announced and the last passengers disappeared down the jet bridge, Elena remained rooted in place. The attendant had dismissed her, but he hadn't broken her spirit. With deliberate steps, she turned and walked back to the terminal seating area, her mind already racing. Elena James had built her life on the belief that no obstacle was too great to overcome. What happened here today wasn't just an isolated insult. It was a symptom of something larger, something that had persisted far too long. And now, Elena knew exactly what she had to do. A stand in silence. Elena James sat silently in the airport terminal, her eyes fixed on the jet bridge where passengers had disappeared moments before. The sting of what had just happened lingered, sharp and persistent. The humiliation wasn't just about being turned away. It was the deeper wound, the insidious undertones that screamed, "You don't belong here." She clenched her hands around the small leather handle of her suitcase, her mind racing with memories of battles she'd fought in her life. But this one was different. This wasn't a personal slight to simply be shrugged off. This was a moment that would echo in her heart for days, months, or perhaps the rest of her life if she let it. Elena had always taught her children and grandchildren that silence could be powerful when used wisely. Today, though, her silence had been forced on her. That flight attendant, Jason, as his name had agreed, hadn't just denied her boarding. He'd dismissed her very existence as someone worthy of respect. The weight of the moment hadn't only been about her. It had been about every person who had ever been told, explicitly or implicitly, that they didn't belong. With a slow exhale, Elena pulled out her phone. Her first call was to Angela. "Grandma." Angela answered cheerfully, her voice cutting through Elena's somber thoughts. "Are you at the airport? How's first class?" Elena hesitated for a moment, deciding how much to tell her. "I'm still at the airport," she said slowly. "I didn't board the flight." "What? What happened?" Angela's tone immediately shifted to concern. Elena told her granddaughter everything, every dismissive look, every cruel word, every silent judgment hanging in the air. By the time she finished, her voice was calm, but Angela was livid. "That's outrageous. I can't believe they treated you like that." "Grandma, I swear I'll. Stop right there, baby, Elena interrupted softly. We don't lash out in anger. I don't want you to lose your peace over this. Angela paused, frustration still evident. But it's not right. You worked your whole life to get where you are. You earned that ticket. How can you just let this go? Elena's voice grew firmer. Who said I'm letting it go? A rare edge crept into her words, calm yet resolute. I'm not going to argue with people who refuse to see my worth. I'm going to make them see it. Angela was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly, What are you going to do? You'll see, Elena replied, a small smile curling at the corners of her lips. I have a few calls to make. A quiet declaration. The airport buzzed around Elena as she scrolled through her contacts, her phone pressed to her ear. Over the decades, she had built a vast network of relationships. Friends, business partners, and allies who knew her as a woman of principle. One of the names on her list stood out, Richard Hall, an old friend who happened to be a lawyer with a specialty in corporate acquisitions. The line connected, and Richard's familiar voice greeted her. Elena, I haven't heard from you in a while. How's retirement treating you? Elena didn't waste time. Richard, I need your help. It's about an airline. An airline? He chuckled, caught off guard. What kind of trouble are you in now, lady? It's not trouble. It's an opportunity, Elena replied. I want to explore the logistics of buying a majority stake in an airline. For a moment, Richard was silent, processing her words. Wait, hold on. Buying an airline. Elena, that's not just ambitious. It's necessary. She cut in, her tone steady and unwavering. Listen to me, Richard. I was humiliated today. Not because of who I am, but because of who they assumed I wasn't. I want to make a point. No, I want to make a change. And I have the means to start. Richard was silent for a beat before responding, more serious this time. You're not kidding about this, are you? Do I ever kid about things that matter? He sighed. No, you don't. All right, Elena. Let's talk numbers, strategy, and next steps. A legacy in motion. The following week was a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and meetings. Elena's determination burned brightly, driving her forward with a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For decades, she had invested wisely. Real estate, stocks, and several businesses that had flourished under her guidance. Now, all of those years of patience and strategy were culminating in this moment. Richard's team dove into the process of identifying the airline's ownership structure and the steps needed to acquire a controlling interest. Elena learned everything she could about the airline, its history, finances, and leadership. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about her experience. It was systemic. Reports surfaced of repeated customer complaints regarding discriminatory treatment, particularly toward minorities and older passengers. Policies designed to ensure inclusivity were inconsistently enforced, and employee training lacked depth. Elena knew she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was stepping up for every person who had been dismissed, underestimated, or denied dignity. The CEO's office. 2 weeks later, Elena walked into the glass-fronted headquarters of the airline. She was dressed sharply in a tailored gray suit, her posture exuding quiet confidence. This wasn't a plea for justice. It was a declaration of her intent to challenge the system at its core. She approached the receptionist at the front desk. I'm here to meet with the CEO, she said, her voice calm. The young woman behind the desk blinked, surprised. Do you have an appointment, ma'am? I do now, Elena replied with a small smile. Let him know Elena James is here, and I've come with a proposition he won't want to ignore. Moments later, Elena was led into a pristine boardroom. Across the table sat the CEO, a middle-aged man with sharp features and an expression that hinted at condescension. I hear you've come with a business proposition, he said, barely hiding his skepticism. Elena met his gaze, unflinching. That's correct. I want to buy into your airline. The CEO chuckled dismissively. Ms. James, buying into a major airline isn't exactly like buying a house. It requires resources most people can only dream of. Alina reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. Then it's a good thing I've been preparing for this my entire life. The CEO's laughter faded as she slid the folder across the table. Inside were financial statements, projections, and a declaration of her intent to purchase a majority stake in the airline. This isn't about money, she continued, her voice steady. It's about creating a culture of dignity and respect, a culture your company desperately needs. The CEO flipped through the documents, his expression shifting from dismissive to unsettled. Alina leaned forward, her gaze sharp. You may have underestimated me, but I promise you, I will not let this go. Whether you work with me or against me, this airline will change. The only question is how long you want to delay the inevitable. The room fell silent. For the first time, Alina saw doubt flicker in the CEO's eyes. The storm before the breakthrough. The air was thick with tension as Alina James walked out of the airline's headquarters. Outside, the sun blazed down, reflecting off the sleek glass building that housed an empire of executives. People who had no idea that change was already at their doorstep. Alina had spent decades being underestimated. It was a pattern she'd grown familiar with. The raised eyebrows when she entered boardrooms, the patronizing tones when she challenged outdated ideas, and the murmurs of, "Who does she think she is?" whispered behind her back. They thought her resolve would crack under pressure, but they were wrong. The CEO's dismissive attitude during their meeting only stoked the fire within her. He hadn't taken her seriously, but that was about to change. The rallying cry. Back in her modest home, a warm and inviting space decorated with family photos and mementos of a life well lived, Alina sat at her dining table. Around her were stacks of documents, a laptop humming softly, and a notepad filled with scribbled ideas. Her granddaughter Angela sat beside her, fingers dancing across her own laptop keyboard. "Grandma, the press will eat this up," Angela said, excitement in her voice as she clicked through a few news websites. It's a David versus Goliath story. A 70-year-old black woman standing up to $1 billion airline. It's inspiring. People need to hear about this. Alina looked up from her notes, a small smile playing at her lips. "Baby, I'm not doing this for fame. I'm doing this to make sure no one ever feels what I felt that day." Angela paused, meeting her grandmother's gaze. "I know, Grandma, but if people hear your story, they'll rally behind you. You've always said that change doesn't happen in silence." Alina nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. If this story can shine a light on what's broken, then let's tell it." Within hours, Angela had crafted an online post, one that told Alina's story in raw, honest detail. It was paired with a photo of Alina holding her unused first-class ticket and included a powerful closing statement. "They tried to make me small, but I refused to shrink. It's time to challenge the systems that allow dignity to be denied. Change is coming." Angela hit post, and together, they watched as the story began to spread. A spark that lit a movement. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media platforms exploded with shares, comments, and messages of support. Within hours, Alina's story was trending. #StandWithAlina became a rallying cry for people around the world who had faced similar treatment. Stories poured in. Black mothers denied service at upscale restaurants, elderly men dismissed in tech stores, women ignored in boardrooms. Alina's experience was a mirror reflecting society's deep-rooted biases, and people were ready to speak up. Major news outlets picked up the story. Reporters knocked on Alina's door, cameras rolling, eager to hear from the woman at the center of the storm. Alina welcomed them with poise and clarity. "I'm not angry," she told one journalist. "Anger fades. What I feel is determination. Determination to make sure people are treated with the dignity they deserve, regardless of who they are or what they look like." Her calm yet powerful words resonated deeply. Interviews aired nationwide, and soon, Alina's name was on every major network. She became a symbol not of rebellion, but of righteous resistance, proof that one person could ignite a movement. Resistance from the old guard. As Elena's story gained traction, the airline found itself thrust into the public spotlight, and not in a good way. Customers threatened boycotts, stock prices dipped, and social media users flooded the airline's accounts with demands for accountability. But behind the scenes, the airline's leadership scrambled to contain the damage. The CEO, the same man who had dismissed Elena weeks earlier, now held emergency meetings with his PR team. "This woman is making us look like villains," one executive complained, pacing the room. "We need to put out a statement." "Not yet," the CEO replied coldly. "If we apologize now, it'll be seen as admitting guilt. We're not going to let this woman dictate the narrative." A younger executive, sitting near the edge of the table, dared to speak up. "Sir, respectfully, ignoring her will only make this worse. She's gaining traction because people believe her. What if we—" The CEO's glare cut him off. "Enough. Let her play her games. This will blow over eventually." But the CEO underestimated the tidal wave Elena had set in motion. It wasn't blowing over. It was only growing stronger. Allies in high places. Elena, meanwhile, wasn't just riding the wave of public support. She was building something greater. Her lawyer, Richard Hall, had been working quietly behind the scenes, reaching out to investors and former airline executives who were sympathetic to her cause. One day, Richard called Elena with news. "You won't believe this. 2 former board members just contacted me. They're ready to talk." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Talk? About what?" "They don't like the current leadership," Richard explained. "They've seen the way this CEO has handled the backlash, and they're fed up. They think the company is in decline and needs a leader with vision. Someone like you." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what Richard was saying. "Are you telling me they want to work with me to change this airline?" "Exactly. If we can secure their support, buying a controlling stake becomes more realistic. It won't be easy, but it's possible." For the first time since this journey began, Elena allowed herself to feel hope. "Then let's get to work." An offer they couldn't ignore. Days later, Elena and Richard sat across the table from the 2 former board members. The meeting took place in a private conference room in a sleek downtown office building. Elena, dressed in her sharpest navy suit, radiated quiet authority as she spoke. "This airline has lost its way," she began. "They've forgotten that their customers are people, not dollar signs. Dignity, respect, and inclusivity aren't luxuries. They're essentials, and I intend to make this airline the standard of excellence, not just in service but in values." The board members listened intently, nodding as she spoke. When Elena finished, one of them leaned forward. "Ms. James, you've done something incredible. You've mobilized the public, but public support alone won't fix this airline. You'll need leadership, resources, and allies." "And I'll have them," Elena replied confidently. "But I need your support to take the first step." The 2 men exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "You have it. We'll help you rally investors and gather the shares you need." Elena felt a surge of gratitude and determination. This wasn't just a plan anymore. It was a movement with momentum. The world watches. As word spread that Elena James was gathering support to challenge the airline's leadership, the world took notice. Media outlets dubbed her the People's Advocate, while others described her as a modern-day hero. Her story wasn't just about a denied first-class seat anymore. It was about challenging the system that had turned its back on the very people it claimed to serve. Reporters hounded the airline for comments, but leadership remained silent, their refusal to engage only fanning the flames. In the meantime, Elena worked tirelessly, meeting with investors, securing allies, and rallying the public to her cause. She didn't rest. She didn't waver. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about dignity. The turning point. Elena James had spent her life achieving the impossible, but nothing she had faced before compared to the enormity of this battle. For weeks, she had worked tirelessly, meeting with investors, strategizing with Richard, and fine-tuning her approach to take on the airline's leadership. It was a war fought in boardrooms and headlines, but beneath it all, it was a fight for dignity. The world watched with bated breath as Elena positioned herself not just as an underdog, but as a visionary. Public opinion was firmly on her side, but support alone wouldn't buy her a seat at the table of corporate power. What she needed was leverage, and slowly but surely, she was gathering it. The enemy strikes back. The airline's leadership, led by its stubborn CEO, finally broke their silence. A press release was issued, filled with carefully polished words. "We value all of our customers and are committed to fostering an inclusive and welcoming environment. We regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred and will work internally to address concerns." It was thinly veiled damage control, a hollow apology without accountability. Elena's name wasn't mentioned, nor was her specific experience acknowledged. The public backlash was swift and brutal. Social media erupted. "This isn't an apology. It's corporate speak for, 'We're not sorry.' Hashtag Stand With Elena isn't a trend. It's a demand for justice. This airline needs to do better, starting with leadership." Behind closed doors, the CEO fumed. "She's made us a joke," he shouted at his team. "This woman has no real power. She's old, irrelevant. The news cycle will move on." But it didn't move on. Elena's refusal to be silenced gave the story momentum. News anchors debated her bold attempt to take control of the airline. Analysts examined its declining stock price. Shareholders grew restless. "The public's against us," one senior advisor warned the CEO. "And shareholders are starting to question your leadership." "Let them question," the CEO growled. "This woman doesn't have the resources to pull this off. I won't let her take us down." Unbeknownst to him, Elena wasn't just moving forward. She was gaining ground. The meeting that changed everything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena sat with Richard in his downtown office, a stunning view of the city stretching behind them. Papers and financial reports littered the table, but Elena's focus was unwavering. "Richard, tell me honestly," she said, looking up from the documents. "Are we close?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "We're closer than I expected, but not close enough. We've secured pledges from a group of investors and allies, but we still don't have a controlling stake." Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "What's the gap?" "About 9%, Richard said with a sigh. "It's the last stretch, and that's always the hardest." Elena tapped her fingers lightly on the table. For a moment, she was silent. Then her gaze sharpened. "Set up a meeting with the largest institutional shareholders. Tomorrow." Richard's eyes widened. "Tomorrow." "Elena, they're sharks. They don't care about public opinion. They care about profits." "Exactly," Elena replied, her voice calm and clear. "And right now, profits are at risk because of this airline's leadership. They need to hear that from someone who isn't afraid of them." The next morning, Elena and Richard entered the gleaming boardroom of a powerful investment firm, one of the airline's largest shareholders. Across the table sat 4 men and women in expensive suits, their expressions unreadable. One of the executives, a gray-haired man with a voice like gravel, leaned forward. "Ms. James, you've certainly stirred up headlines, but we don't invest based on headlines. What exactly are you proposing?" Elena didn't flinch. She opened the folder in front of her, pulling out a series of reports. "What I'm proposing is leadership that understands what this airline has forgotten. Your customers are your lifeline. Dignity, respect, and service drive loyalty. Without them, your profits will bleed out." She slid the reports across the table, continuing. "In the last month alone, stock prices have fallen 11%. Public trust is plummeting. This isn't just a PR nightmare. It's a systemic failure under current leadership. I intend to turn that around." "And how do you plan to do that?" Another executive asked, skepticism in his tone. "By changing the culture," Elena replied firmly. "This company needs to rebuild trust. That starts with leadership committed to accountability, inclusivity, and innovation. I have the experience to make that happen, and I have the world behind me." The room fell silent. The executives exchanged glances, surprised by Alina's confidence. Finally, the gray-haired man spoke. "And what do you need from us?" "I need your support to finalize the acquisition of a controlling stake," Alina said. "Work with me, and I'll not only save this airline, I'll make it a leader in the industry again." The power of persistence. The meeting ended without a commitment, but Alina left knowing she had planted a seed. Over the next several days, news spread that institutional shareholders were considering shifting their votes to support her bid. Analysts called it unprecedented. Journalists called it historic. But not everyone was thrilled. The CEO, now under intense scrutiny, held a press conference. His expression was tight, his tone combative. "Ms. James is exploiting a personal grievance to disrupt our operations," he declared. "We are a strong and stable company, and I refuse to let someone with no experience in aviation dictate our future." Alina watched the press conference from her living room, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Desperation," she murmured. "He's feeling the pressure." Angela, sitting beside her, grinned. "He's losing control, Grandma. You've got him running scared." The final stretch. Days turned into weeks as the final pieces fell into place. Richard's team worked tirelessly, securing pledges from smaller shareholders and allies. With every call and every meeting, momentum grew. Finally, one evening, Richard called Alina with the news she had been waiting for. "Alina, we did it," he said, his voice triumphant. "We've secured the 51% we need. You're about to become the largest shareholder in the airline." Alina sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the words settling over her. She had done it. Against all odds, she had taken on a corporation, turned public opinion into power, and achieved what no one believed possible. "Let's schedule the vote," Alina said softly, determination still burning in her voice. "It's time to finish this." The showdown in the boardroom. The morning sunlight cast sharp angles across the glass walls of the airline's corporate headquarters. Outside, the city buzzed with life. But inside, the tension was palpable. Today was the day the impossible became reality. Alina James stood in the lobby, her presence commanding as ever. At 70 years old, she looked every bit the force of nature she had proven herself to be, poised, confident, and immovable. Dressed in a tailored cream-colored suit with subtle gold accents and her pearl necklace gleaming against her skin, she looked both regal and resolute. She had fought for this moment, step by painstaking step, and today the final battle would be waged. Richard stood beside her, holding a leather briefcase filled with documents. "Alina, we've got everything lined up. The votes, the legal standing, the shareholders' support. But I won't lie to you. The CEO isn't going to go quietly. I'm not here to worry about him," Alina replied calmly. "I'm here to finish what I started." Angela, who had accompanied her grandmother every step of the way, beamed with pride. "Grandma, you've already won in my eyes. But make sure you knock them off their high horse, all right?" Alina chuckled softly, patting Angela's hand. "Don't you worry, baby. I've never been afraid of heights." Walking into the lion's den. The boardroom was cavernous and modern, the kind of space designed to intimidate. A long mahogany table stretched down the center, flanked by high-backed leather chairs. A massive window offered a sweeping view of the skyline, but no one was paying attention to the view. The room was filled with faces, shareholders, executives, and legal advisors, many of whom Alina had fought to win over. At the far end of the table sat the CEO, his jaw tight, his body language radiating defiance. He rose as Alina and Richard entered. "Ms. James," he said coolly, extending a hand she ignored. "You've certainly created quite a spectacle." "Spectacle," Alina echoed, setting her bag on the table. "I call it accountability." She pulled out her documents and met his gaze head-on. You and I both know why we're here." He narrowed his eyes, masking the uncertainty that flickered in their depths. "We'll see who walks out of this room victorious." Alina smiled faintly, unfazed. "Indeed, we will." The vote begins. The meeting was called to order. The board chair, a seasoned executive with silver hair and glasses, perched low on his nose, cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to address an extraordinary proposal from Ms. Alina James, who has secured the necessary shareholder support to challenge the current leadership of this airline. We will hear from both parties before moving to a vote." The CEO wasted no time in launching into his argument. He spoke with practiced authority, his voice carrying through the room as he paced the floor. "This airline has operated successfully under my leadership for years. Yes, we've faced recent challenges, but those are external pressures, temporary setbacks. Ms. James, while passionate, has no experience in aviation, no understanding of the complexities of running a multinational corporation. Replacing seasoned leadership with someone unqualified would be reckless and disastrous for shareholders." Murmurs rose across the table. Some nodded in agreement, while others glanced at Alina, curious to see how she would respond. The CEO turned to face her, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Ms. James, the floor is yours. I suggest you use this time wisely." Alina's response. Alina stood, unhurried and unshaken. The room quieted as she placed her hands on the table, her voice steady and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, I may not have spent my life in aviation, but I have spent it building businesses, earning respect, and learning what it means to lead. Leadership isn't about familiarity with engines and flight schedules. It's about understanding people. You can run a company on numbers and spreadsheets, but if you forget the human beings who make up those numbers, your customers, your employees, you've already failed." She let her words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "This isn't about one bad flight attendant or one bad CEO. It's about a culture of arrogance and disregard that has been allowed to fester under the current leadership. You've seen it in the headlines. You've heard it from customers. And now you're seeing it reflected in your plummeting stock prices." A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Alina pressed on. "I represent more than myself. I represent every person who has been told they don't belong, who has been made to feel small and invisible. That stops today. I'm not asking for control of this airline because I want power. I'm asking because I know what it will take to fix what's broken." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a binder. "Here is my plan. A comprehensive, actionable strategy to rebuild trust, improve customer service, and modernize operations. It's not empty promises. It's a roadmap to recovery." She looked each board member in the eye, her voice rising with conviction. "You have a choice today. You can cling to the past, to leadership that has proven unwilling to change, or you can embrace the future, a future where this airline leads by example, not by reputation." The room fell silent. Even the CEO, now visibly rattled, had nothing to say. The vote. The board chair cleared his throat. "Thank you, Ms. James. We will now proceed to the vote." Richard leaned toward Alina, whispering, "They're shaken, but it'll be close." One by one, the shareholders cast their votes. Each aye or nay felt like a heartbeat in Alina's chest, steady but pounding. She sat still, her hands folded, her face betraying nothing as the count proceeded. Finally, the chair called for silence. "The votes have been tallied," he announced. "With 51.4% of the shares in support, the motion to replace the current leadership with Ms. Alina James has passed." The room erupted. Richard squeezed Alina's arm in triumph. Angela, who had quietly entered the room near the back, covered her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. The CEO, pale and stunned, stood motionless. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You can't be serious." Alina turned to him, her voice calm but cutting. "Oh, I'm serious. The difference is, unlike you, I don't underestimate people. And now, it's time for change. A new dawn. Outside the headquarters, reporters swarmed the building, cameras flashing as Elena emerged, flanked by Richard and Angela. The crowd erupted with applause as she raised her hand. "Ms. James, Ms. James," shouted one journalist. "What's your first priority as the new leader of the airline?" Elena smiled, her voice carrying over the noise. "To remind this company, and the world, that dignity is not a luxury. It's a right." Her words echoed across the crowd, a promise that her fight was not just about one airline, but about the people it served. A new legacy takes flight. The boardroom battle was over, but for Elena James, the real work had only just begun. Securing a controlling stake and ousting the old leadership was a monumental victory, but it wasn't the final chapter of her story. No, she thought as she stood on the balcony of her new office overlooking the bustling city skyline. This is just the beginning. In the weeks following her unprecedented rise to power, headlines continued to sing her praises. The woman who bought an airline to demand respect. Elena James, the people's advocate turns CEO. Dignity takes flight. How one woman is redefining an industry. But while the world celebrated her bold stand, Elena remained focused on the enormous task ahead. Transforming the airline into a symbol of excellence, equality, and inclusivity. The first day at the helm. Elena entered the executive suite on her first day as CEO with Angela and Richard by her side. Employees stared in hushed awe as she passed, a woman they had only seen on the news now walking the very halls of power. Elena greeted every person she encountered with a warm smile, from the janitor mopping the marble floors to the senior executives awaiting her arrival in the conference room. For her, leadership wasn't about position, it was about connection. At precisely 9 a.m., she stepped into the boardroom for her first company-wide address. Executives sat stiffly at the table, many still wary of the changes to come. A live broadcast streamed to thousands of employees across the company's global offices, all eager to hear from their new leader. Elena stood at the head of the table, a calm authority radiating from her. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I know many of you are wondering what comes next. Change is never easy, but let me assure you, it's necessary. This airline has lost its way. Somewhere along the line, we forgot that our customers are our foundation, that our employees, you, are our greatest asset, and that dignity and respect aren't optional. They're essential. Starting today, we're going to rebuild this company on values that matter." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. Change begins with action. So here's what's going to happen. Effective immediately, we are implementing a 3-step initiative to address the culture, policies, and future of this airline. Step 1. A culture reset. Elena's first move was to address the toxic culture that had seeped into the company. She ordered a top-to-bottom review of customer service practices, requiring every employee, executives included, to undergo diversity, inclusivity, and empathy training. No exceptions, Elena told her executive team. If we expect our employees to treat customers with dignity, leadership must lead by example. She didn't just stop at training. Elena introduced an anonymous feedback system that allowed employees and customers alike to report discrimination, bias, or mistreatment without fear of retaliation. For frontline workers, it was a breath of fresh air. For longtime executives who had been complacent under the old leadership, it was a wake-up call. Angela, who had taken on a role as her grandmother's special advisor, marveled at the progress. "Grandma, you're not just changing a company, you're changing how people think." Elena smiled softly. "One step at a time, baby." Step 2. Accountability in action. Elena's second initiative sent ripples through the entire industry. She conducted a comprehensive audit of hiring, promotion, and service policies to identify systemic biases. The findings were clear. Minority employees were underrepresented in leadership roles, and customer complaints about discriminatory treatment were often ignored or dismissed. At a press conference, Alina stood at the podium, holding the company's findings for all to see. "We cannot fix what we refuse to acknowledge," she said firmly. "The truth is uncomfortable, but ignoring it will not make it go away. I will not allow this company to perpetuate a culture of inequality." Her announcement included a bold action plan: hiring equity programs to bring greater diversity to leadership roles, customer accountability systems to ensure complaints were addressed fairly and transparently, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind, with immediate consequences for violations. The changes were swift and unapologetic. News outlets praised her courage. Critics, of course, emerged, but Alina refused to let them sway her. "Leadership means making hard choices," she told Richard during a late-night meeting. "If I wanted to be liked by everyone, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair." Step 3. Rebuilding trust. The third and most ambitious part of Alina's initiative focused on restoring trust with customers. She invited former customers who had experienced mistreatment, including the very same customers whose voices had been ignored for years, to a special summit. It was a historic move, one that no airline had attempted before. At the event, Alina stood before hundreds of guests: mothers, fathers, elderly travelers, professionals, all people who had felt dismissed and unheard. "I invited you here today because your voices matter," she began, her tone sincere and full of warmth. "I know an apology won't erase what happened, but I want you to know that this company is listening, and we are committed to earning back your trust." She outlined the concrete changes underway and introduced a new customer-first program that would prioritize transparency, service quality, and comfort. The event made headlines, and testimonials poured in from attendees who said they finally felt seen. A symbol of progress. Months passed, and the results of Alina's leadership began to show. Employee morale skyrocketed as they saw a new culture of respect take root. Customers returned, praising the airline for its improved service and transparency. Stock prices rebounded, stronger than ever, and analysts called the transformation nothing short of revolutionary. At a shareholders' meeting 6 months after taking the helm, Alina stood before a room filled with people who had once doubted her. "This company is thriving because we chose to embrace change," she said proudly. "We remembered that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you honor." A final reflection. 1 year after her first-class ticket had been denied, Alina James found herself boarding a flight, not as a passenger this time, but as the guest of honor. The plane had been renamed the Alina James, a tribute to the woman who had reshaped the skies. As she walked down the jet bridge, Angela at her side, the flight attendants, newly trained and full of pride, greeted her warmly. "Welcome aboard, Ms. James," a young attendant said with a smile. "It's an honor to have you here." Alina returned the smile, her heart full. She took her seat in first class, gazing out the window as the plane prepared for takeoff. Angela leaned over, her eyes shining. "Grandma, did you ever think it would come to this?" Alina turned to her, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't think about what was possible. I thought about what was necessary. Sometimes, baby, life gives you a moment, and what you do with that moment can change everything." As the plane soared into the sky, Alina allowed herself a quiet smile. Her fight had begun with humiliation, but it had ended with hope, and a legacy that would inspire generations to come.